Jerusalem. Exactly 50 days after the public execution of the Galilean leader, a group of 120 fugitives is locked inside a house in the upper part of the city, hiding from the same religious and political leaders who demanded the crucifixion. The absolute security of that hiding place is suddenly shattered, not by an invasion of Roman soldiers, but by a deafening physical roar similar to a hurricane that paralyzes the routine of the capital and draws a crowd to the door. That day was not merely a mystical and invisible phenomenon. It was a logistical, acoustic, and political incident that shook the foundations of Israel and challenged the Roman Empire. The image that survived through the centuries is almost peaceful. A silent stone room, people sitting in harmony, small flames of fire gently descending upon their heads. This comforting vision, immortalized in Renaissance paintings, ended up almost completely erasing the harsh and chaotic historical reality of that day. The event the world now knows as the First Pentecost did not happen in a vacuum of tranquility. It detonated at the epicenter of a social cauldron that was about to explode. It was the Feast of Shavuot. Under the scorching heat, the mathematics of Jerusalem had been completely disrupted. The city's usual population had multiplied exponentially, transforming alleys and squares into a suffocating labyrinth. The markets were impassable, and the temple courtyards bore the weight of thousands of foreigners. There was a heavy atmosphere in the streets, a mixture of religious fervor and maximum military alert. To understand the true clash of power and the level of confusion generated in the hours that followed, it is necessary to temporarily forget the classic illustrations. We need to look at the engineering of that capital, at the acoustics of its limestone walls, and at the strategic map of first-century Jerusalem. What occurred that morning was not a silent spiritual retreat. It was a brutal breach of protocol that disoriented the Roman guard, paralyzed the priests, and forced those fugitives out of their survival hideout straight into the nerve center of the ancient world. Jerusalem was not designed to withstand what was happening during those weeks. The mathematics were relentless. On ordinary days, the capital housed around 80,000 souls. A bustling commercial city built upon uneven hills, yet functioning in balance within its own routine of priests, merchants, and soldiers. However, the Feast of Shavuot shattered every illusion of order. In a matter of days, the dusty roads leading up to the city poured out an incalculable human tide. Historical estimates indicate that the population surged to nearly 1 million people. Imagine the structural and logistical collapse of an ancient infrastructure. There were not enough inns. There were not enough beds in private homes. Improvised tents covered the valleys surrounding the walls, spreading like a white sea all the way to the Mount of Olives. Inside the city, the narrow streets, which barely allowed 2 small carts to pass side by side, became rivers of people pressed against irregular limestone walls. The air in the lower streets grew heavy, almost suffocating at certain hours of the day, dense with the uninterrupted smell of campfires, the sweat of long journeys, and thousands of animals brought for the sacred rituals in the temple. And it was not merely a matter of human volume. It was a true collision of worlds. If you walked through the monumental stairways leading to the courtyards of the Temple Mount, you would be bombarded by a disorienting cacophony of languages. Jews of the diaspora had traveled for months, crossing arid deserts and dangerous seas, simply to fulfill the ancestral commandment of pilgrimage. There were wealthy merchants from distant Parthia and Media, dressed in thick, colorful tunics. There were intellectuals from Alexandria, debating on street corners in polished, rapid Greek. Exhausted travelers from the province of Asia, from Rome, from the Arabian deserts, and from the banks of the Nile in Egypt, men and women who shared the same covenant, yet culturally were complete strangers to one another. They brought their clinking coins, their regional customs, their striking accents, and above all, their absolute fervor. That fervor was, politically speaking, the perfect fuel for a disaster of epic proportions. Shavuot celebrated the first fruits of the harvest, but it also commemorated the most powerful event of that nation, the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. It was the exact moment of the year when Jewish national identity reached its maximum intensity. The constant reminder that they were a separate nation boiled in the veins of the crowd, contrasting bitterly and silently with the reality of being a province controlled by a pagan empire. There was a suffocating messianic expectation in the air. Many pilgrims murmured about liberation. Others still whispered, with restrained voices and suspicious glances, about the Galilean leader who had faced the fury of the empire and met his tragic end on the cross only 50 days earlier during the chaos of Passover. The atmosphere was not one of serene celebration. It was one of relentless agitation. From above, cold and calculating eyes watched every movement in the crowded squares. The Antonia Fortress, an imposing and gigantic stone military structure that loomed intimidatingly like a constant shadow over the northern courtyard of the temple, operated under maximum alert. The Roman governor and the Praetorian Guard knew Jerusalem's historical pattern perfectly well. An overcrowded crowd combined with religious zeal inevitably resulted in rebellion. To the eagles of Rome, the liturgy of those people meant little. What mattered was the non-negotiable maintenance of public order. The soldiers patrolled the upper passageways with their hands resting on the pommels of their swords, their leather and metal armor reflecting the harsh Judean sun. They were ready to crush any spark before it turned into a fire. If a single radical leader rose up within that crowd, if a single cry of insurrection echoed through the courtyards, the military response would be immediate. Rome did not debate with riots. It crushed them with full force and severe consequences. In the midst of that colossal machinery of political tension, on the verge of collapsing under its own demographic pressure, there was an invisible element, something that completely escaped Roman military intelligence and the relentless surveillance of the priestly elite. While the capital boiled in the streets and soldiers sweated beneath the weight of their armor, the powder keg would not be detonated by an armed revolt. The spark that would shake the city's foundations was hidden in absolute silence, waiting for the exact moment. The history of Jerusalem is dense, complex, and transformative. Our objective here is to rescue these events and bring them to you with the greatest possible faithfulness, reconstructing the past with the depth it demands. If this level of documentary made sense to you and enriched your knowledge today, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. That support is the true foundation that allows us to continue researching and producing content with this level of quality. And before you go, scroll down to the comments and tell me which country you are watching us from. Our community crosses borders, and I make a point of reading and replying to each one of you with great pleasure. Far from the Roman patrols and the nervous epicenter of the temple, in the irregular stone alleyways of the upper city, a small group struggled against silent panic. They were not participating in the festive atmosphere. They were not wandering through the colorful markets that morning, nor negotiating lambs for the daily ritual. 120 men and women remained secluded, hidden from the public eye. Later tradition, heavily influenced by centuries of sacred art, romanticized that place. They named it the Upper Room, often portraying it as a serene, luminous environment bathed in soft, divine light where people waited in deep peace. But the harsh archaeological and political reality of that Shavuot morning tells an infinitely darker story. That place, in that exact historical context, was not a serene sanctuary of retreat. It was a survival bunker. 50 days earlier, the power structure of the capital had demonstrated all of its strength. The leader of that Galilean group had been torn from their midst in the dead of night, dragged through rushed tribunals, and handed over to the Romans to face the final torment under heavy pressure from the religious elite. The dust of that relentless execution had not yet settled. The Sanhedrin, the supreme Jewish court, and the true center of local control had not forgotten the tensions of that Passover. For the temple authorities, silencing the remaining voices of that movement was not merely a matter of liturgy. It was an unfinished political task, just as urgent as eliminating the head of the group had been. The danger there was absolutely tangible. A logistical miscalculation, a word spoken on the wrong street corner, or even the mere recognition of the drawn-out Galilean accent in the narrow streets could trigger accusations and, inevitably, summary arrests. Therefore, the decision to lock themselves inside an upper room was far more than simply a matter of space to shelter more than 100 people. In the engineering of Jerusalem's elite residences, particularly in the noble area of the upper city, where robust limestone mansions overlooked the slopes of the old city, the upper floor possessed an inherently military and strategic function. Usually accessible only by an external stone staircase or through inner courtyards heavily protected by high walls, that rooftop chamber offered what every group of fugitives needs: high ground. Occupying the highest floor of the mansion created a formidable tactical bottleneck. The Sanhedrin Guard, known for its efficient nighttime operations, would immediately lose the element of surprise. Armed officers could not climb stone steps without warning those at the top in advance. The physical structure of the house itself functioned as a primary shield of isolation. Beyond rigid security against invasions, the elevation provided something even more valuable in an overcrowded capital: visual perimeter control. Through the small windows carved into the thick masonry, or through cracks in the walls, the group could monitor the street invisibly. They could watch the sun reflecting off the armor of Roman patrols passing in the distance, observe delegations of priests crossing the city, and witness the suffocating and chaotic tide of pilgrims squeezing through the lower levels. Partial sound isolation was also crucial. While the city below boiled, vibrating with the thunderous noise of a million voices, the clinking of foreign coins, the sound of countless animals, and the thick smoke of sacrifices, the upper room retained a heavy and expectant silence. The tension within those four walls must have been dense enough to cut. Fishermen, accustomed to the free winds of northern Israel, were now trapped inside a suffocating room in hostile territory. Women who had closely witnessed the trauma of Golgotha now watched every suspicious sound coming from the courtyard below. The human instinct for self-preservation surely screamed for them to flee back to the calm shores of the Sea of Galilee, far beyond the legal reach of Jerusalem's authorities. Remaining there, at the exact moment when the city was receiving its maximum population load and the military guard operated with zero tolerance, bordered on strategic insanity, but they stayed. There had been a clear and non-negotiable directive given before the master's departure: remain in Jerusalem and wait. They did everything that human intelligence and the architecture of the time allowed them to do in order to survive. They found the safest point in the city, set up a watch, locked the entrances, and disappeared from the sight of the empire. The hiding place seemed perfect. Their invisibility was absolute, but they had no idea that the command to wait was not an evasive maneuver. It was surgical preparation for a frontal impact, and within minutes, the thick stone walls, the security locks, and that entire careful system of silent survival would be mercilessly obliterated from the inside out. It was nearly 9 in the morning. The Judean sun had already begun to mercilessly heat the stones of the upper city. Inside that carefully locked room, silence was the only guarantee of survival for those 120 men and women. They were invisible to the radar of the Sanhedrin, undetectable to the Roman patrols sweeping the commercial streets in relentless shifts. The tactical withdrawal plan was working perfectly, until physics intervened. The historical record left in the book of Acts describes the beginning of the event with a phrase that is often read too quickly, without the weight of its real context. Suddenly, there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind. The central word in that description is not wind, it is sound. The original Greek text uses terms that denote a monumental acoustic roar, not necessarily a storm pushing doors or tearing roofs apart. What fell upon that place was an auditory phenomenon of overwhelming proportions, surgically focused on the exact coordinates of that residence. To understand the practical collapse this generated, it is essential to look at the engineering and topography of first-century Jerusalem. The capital was not a city of large open spaces outside the restricted temple area. It was a dense cluster of solid limestone. The streets were narrow, steep, winding alleyways lined with tall, continuous walls that formed true corridors of stone. Acoustically, that structure operated like a gigantic funnel. Any sharp noise produced in the upper city, the highest point in the western urban topography, not only traveled downward toward the valley, but gained resonance, ricocheting off the narrow walls until it reached the bustling markets and overcrowded courtyards miles below. Try to visualize the impact of a deafening roar tearing through the clear sky of a spring morning. There were no heavy clouds forming on the horizon. There was no smell of rain, nor the sudden drop in pressure that precedes desert storms. It was a continuous, dense roar, similar to the turbine of a catastrophic gale, yet concentrated at the epicenter of one of the most heavily monitored and politically tense cities in the empire. The acoustic vibration was so dense that the masonry of the mansion itself seemed to bend under the pressure. In that exact fraction of a second, the group's entire security and isolation system was pulverized. The worst thing that can happen to a clandestine bunker is not to be sniffed out by a random patrol of priests. It is to suddenly become the object of attention for an entire metropolis. The unnatural sound did not merely cause fear, it exerted a disturbing magnetism. Pilgrims negotiating sheep in the lower areas stopped. Men accustomed to the earthquakes of Asia Minor and merchants familiar with the unpredictable storms of the Mediterranean knew very well how to identify natural phenomena. But this contradicted the logic of nature. The sound acted like a gravitational emergency alarm, pulling thousands of people directly toward the doors of an address that needed to remain hidden at all costs. Their tactical invisibility disappeared in the blink of an eye. That silent mansion saw the streets around it flooded by a thick, confused, and highly alert human wave. The disordered and converging crowd just below the window is the greatest nightmare of any group on the run. From the top of the Antonia fortress, Roman intelligence inevitably noticed the anomaly. Legionaries tightened their grip on their spears as they saw the population flow abruptly changing direction. While chaos erupted outside, inside the room, shock gave way to something that military logic or pure survival instinct could never explain. The wall of fear imploded from the inside out. Men who little more than a month earlier had hidden in the shadows of dark alleyways while their leader faced the merciless tribunal of Caiaphas, women carrying the indelible trauma of watching a final torment from a distance, now felt an undeniable force taking absolute control of their minds and voices. The refuge no longer served any purpose. The protection of the thick walls had become a limiting barrier in the face of the magnitude of what pulsed within them. Remaining silent and waiting for the crowd to disperse would have been the only logical way to survive another day in Jerusalem. But the phenomenon ripped them out of that passivity. It did not merely bring the entire city to the door of the house, it swallowed human terror and pushed them outward. The heavy wooden locks were opened. Without asking permission, the group abandoned tactical comfort, descended the stone steps, and marched directly into open confrontation, emerging from the shadows of exile into the scorching light of day, toward a sea of bewildered faces waiting for them. The mystery of the sound of the mighty rushing wind that disoriented the Roman guard and paralyzed the priests of the capital reminds us of how much there still is to explore within the biblical accounts. There are incredible details hidden in architecture, politics, and ancient prophecies waiting to be rediscovered. If you wish to go beyond these isolated stories and immerse yourself in a complete, clear, and chronological vision of the events, discover our exclusive ebook, The Bible in Chronological Order. This practical material organizes every episode of the Bible from creation to Revelation in a clear and visual way, with complete timelines and explanatory charts to make your study easier. The ebook offers an overview of the fall of Samaria and Jerusalem, the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and much more. Click the link in the description or the pinned comment and have in your hands the best guide to deepen your understanding of the greatest story ever told. The heavy wooden door of the mansion finally gave way, not through the force of a temple guard battering ram or the shields of the Roman legion, but through the hands of the fugitives themselves. When those 120 men and women crossed the threshold and descended the stone stairs toward the stunned crowd, the power dynamics of Jerusalem were permanently altered. The hunt was over. The hiding place was no longer necessary. What the crowd of pilgrims found was not a group of panicked people trying to explain the deafening roar, but a force that stood completely fearless. And then, the true chaos erupted in the streets of the upper city. Not the chaos caused by the sound of a hurricane, but the brutal shock of language. To understand the gravity of the paradigm shift that occurred in those minutes, it is vital to understand who the pieces on that board were. For the priestly elite of the Sanhedrin and the intellectuals who circulated through the polished courtyards of Jerusalem, Galileans were second-class citizens. They came from the agrarian north, from fishing villages and dusty peasant lands. They were men who did not attend rabbinical academies, who possessed no formal refinement, and, above all, carried an extremely strong and drawn-out regional accent, an unmistakable trademark. A Galilean could not disguise his origin when he opened his mouth in the south. His pronunciation was an easy target for mockery and prejudice from the educated class. And yet, while the crowd pressed and shoved through the alleys surrounding the mansion, what was heard next contradicted every law of linguistics, education, and human logic. Those same fishermen and peasants began communicating simultaneously, loudly, and flawlessly. The historical account is surgical. This was not unintelligible babbling, ecstatic delirium, or murmurs lost in the wind. They were articulating structured speeches with absolute fluency in languages they had never studied or even encountered. Disorientation swept through the square like a shock wave. Before the Galilean group stood pilgrims of the diaspora from every corner of the known world. There were businessmen from distant Parthia, horse merchants from Media, travelers from Mesopotamia, inhabitants of the coastal regions of Asia Minor, from Phrygia, from Egypt, mercenaries from Arabia, and citizens from the capital of the empire itself, Rome. The mathematics were absurd. At least 15 distinct provinces and linguistic regions were represented beneath that blazing sun. Each of those foreigners who normally relied on commercial Greek or broken Aramaic to survive negotiations in Judea suddenly began hearing the wonders of God proclaimed crystal clearly in their own native dialect. The natural regional accent of their homeland was coming perfectly out of the mouths of strangers who had never crossed the borders of northern Israel. The cultural barrier imposed by the continental distances of the Roman Empire was obliterated on the pavement of a narrow street. The situation escaped entirely from the control of local intelligence. The spies and temple guards who had infiltrated the crowd to monitor and suppress any spark of rebellion watched the narrative melt in their hands. They needed to smother that crisis immediately before the fervor grew into something politically uncontrollable. And the Roman Praetorian Guard, watching everything from the Antonia fortress, decided to crush the confusion with swords. Lacking any tactical or natural explanation for what their ears were witnessing, the religious leadership resorted to a desperate smear strategy that bordered on the absurd. They began spreading an aggressive rumor through the edges of the crowd, shouting in an attempt to discredit the men. "They are drunk on sweet wine." The attempt to suppress the crisis was illogical by every human standard. It was 9 in the morning. The daily commerce of the festivities was only beginning to awaken. More than that, biologically, extreme drunkenness dulls reasoning and slurs speech. Drunkenness does not grant spontaneous fluency in more than a dozen complex foreign dialects. But it was the only primitive weapon the authorities had left to try to contain the gravity of the event. The accusation cut through the hot air and reached the ears of the group. Weeks earlier, far less aggressive words had driven these same men into the shadows of the night, abandoning their master to the mercy of soldiers. But in that exact second, the fear of the cross and the instinct of self-preservation vanished completely. The tactical isolation of those four walls had been left behind. The leader of the fishermen, the same man who had cowardly denied his master before a simple servant girl in a dark courtyard, stepped forward. Peter took the front line in the center of the public square, raised his voice above the cacophony of 15 languages and the murmur of shallow accusations, ready for direct confrontation against the highest political and religious authorities in Jerusalem. The sun finally began to set behind the hills of Judea, painting the thick walls of Jerusalem in a dark orange tone. The deafening noise that had paralyzed the morning gave way to the familiar murmur of nighttime campfires scattered throughout the valleys below. For the Roman governor stationed at the Antonia fortress, and for the high priests of the Sanhedrin, the end of the afternoon seemed to mark the relief of another chaotic Shavuot holiday finally coming to a close. The overcrowded crowds were beginning to retreat to their tents, and the temporary illusion that imperial order had been restored brought comfort to the local authorities. But they were tragically mistaken. Nightfall in Jerusalem did not mark the end of a regional crisis. It marked the birth of an invisible and absolutely uncontrollable network of expansion. The 3,000 men and women who had descended the southern stairways of the Temple Mount and simultaneously passed through the waters of the Herodian purification complexes were not simple Galilean peasants or permanent residents of Jerusalem. They were the lifeblood of the diaspora. They were wealthy merchants who knew the commercial routes of Asia Minor, skilled craftsmen from North Africa, experienced navigators of the Mediterranean, and influential citizens deeply connected within the heart of Rome. They would not remain trapped in Judea. The mathematics of that Pentecost day revealed itself to be a strategic masterpiece of global proportions. When the festivities came to an end and the camps began to be dismantled, Those 3,000 people packed their belongings, descended the arid mountains of Israel, and began the long journey back to their nations. As they made their way home, however, they carried far more than spices, scrolls, or liturgical souvenirs from the temple. They carried within them the genetic code of a movement that was about to rewrite human history. In a completely organic and decentralized way, those anonymous travelers inserted the new message directly into the commercial, political, and intellectual arteries of the ancient world. They established the silent and solid foundations of primitive Christianity in the synagogues of the province of Asia, in the commercial ports of Egypt, and in the districts of Rome, years and even decades before any famous apostle or commissioned missionary would even think about setting foot in Europe. For Roman military intelligence, accustomed to dealing with armed insurgencies and nationalist leaders wielding swords, what occurred was a fatal misreading. They searched for a rebel army to crush with the brute force of the legions, but it is impossible to crucify an idea that has already infiltrated 15 different provinces within a matter of days, spread by citizens above all suspicion. That closed room on the upper floor of the upper city, which began the morning as a survival bunker locked tight against the fear of the authorities, proved to be far more than a temporary hiding place. The upper room was the surgical epicenter of a perfectly calculated explosion. The acoustic phenomenon shook the limestone foundations of Jerusalem, but the true shockwave formed within those narrow streets would, centuries later, bring down the unbeatable structure of the Roman Empire. Reaching this level of historical, archaeological, and strategic detail requires deep research and absolute dedication to the facts. Our commitment is to rescue the truth that is often hidden behind tradition and deliver it to you with cinematic documentary quality. If you value this work and want to directly support the production of more content with this level of depth, I invite you to become a channel member. By clicking the Join button below the video, you sponsor our research and, in return, gain access to exclusive benefits such as loyalty badges, early content access, and direct contact with our team. Join our community and help us continue telling the greatest story of all time.